I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
Welcome back to the Millennial Classic Show. My name is Q, and on this show, we talk about the best and most memorable movies, books, and culture-changing events from our generation. Today, we are talking about Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. And this is the memoir, the autobiography of Glenn C. Loury. What a fucking book. I was shook reading this book that someone like Glenn Loury would talk about his life so openly. I just recently did a review of Kamala's book, Kamala Harris, and I was screaming to the book the entire time. This feels like nothing. It feels like a list of her accomplishments. Glenn Loury is currently a professor at Brown University, a tenured professor. He's an economist. He's taught economy at the best of the best schools. Yes, he was the first Black economist tenured professor at Harvard. He's a special dude. But the shit he talks about in this book blows your fucking mind. It is incredible. I think this should be a read. And yes, the subtitle of Confessions of a Black Conservative. If you were Black, his life story is going to be so eye-opening to try to understand. He is a conservative. He is Black. He is an elite member of America. And all of these things in different times of his life are shining through the most, but he is all of these things. He has the potential of all of these things in him all of the time. And it is a beautiful read knowing who he is at the end of his life and seeing where he came from. So a couple of the highlights, and there's two major highlights that I think that just speak volumes in this book. Number one, Glenn Loury lived the American dream. The book starts out, his life starts out living in the south side of Chicago, I think in the 40s or 50s, and he was living in his mom's sister's second attic of a home. It was such a small space that he slept on the couch his entire childhood. It is incredible to think that that's the man that ended up being a tenured professor at Harvard, the first African-American economist to do so. Rags to riches story, his life is the American dream in every sense of the word. Right? It is incredible. But that ties into the second highlight that I have of this book. There are some people that you see, there's some autobiographies that you read of people and you're like, holy shit, it's hopeful. It's like, this is doable. And I've got to say, and I got to be honest here, it just seems like Glenn, Mr. Loury, was born a genius. He kind of is a genius. His academic success is incredible. Right from the get, in his young childhood, he's really good at chess. He's very good at math. He gets put into this advanced math school. There is something there. He gets in trouble pretty quickly, and I'll talk about the lowlights in a hot second, which makes him get off the straight and narrow course to success. His course to success was quite windy, but his academic success is truly beautiful, and this speaks so much to his outlook on life, because I think he is born a genius. And I say that not to downplay the fact that he had to work his fucking ass off, because he truly did. If you read the book, you will know he worked his fucking ass off. But the leaps that he took in academia, I don't think is normal. It isn't normal for those folks who are born with everything at their fingertips. He does have something special about him, a gift, a talent that was just in him naturally. He found a way to live the American dream using the gifts that he was given. And most people don't have those gifts. That's the only reason I disagree with all of his conservative recommendations, suggestions for Black America. But we'll get to that when we get to that. I just want to say those two highlights will keep you in this book. Number one, the fact that it is the American dream. Seeing where he starts out from, knowing where he ends up, it is truly spectacular. Being an academic, being a professor, at least from my perspective, seems like such a boring profession, a boring job. On top of that, not that I don't like numbers, but there's nothing about numbers that excite me, that get me going. So I thought I wouldn't give a shit about the economist that Glenn Loury was. Great, you're really smart, you're an economist, but what does that have to do with me? It is, I'm not going to lie to you, the Black conservative part that pulled me into the story. Not the conservative part, and not even mainly the Black part, but how he uses economics to speak to the issues in the world, specifically with Black America. But if he used economics to talk about anything, it would come out beautifully. A couple of things about his academic success that you learn about the book. Did you know that Glenn Loury was the dude who coined the term social capital? Yes. Glenn Loury, this man from South Side of Chicago, is the one that coined that term, and beautifully so in this piece that he has. I think it's absolutely beautiful. In fact, while I'm talking about it, why don't I pull up the actual fucking quote here so we can all listen to it together, because it's so beautifully done, beautifully when they're describing his paper. So I just want you guys to listen to this because it's one of the most beautiful things.
My dissertation, Essays in the Theory of the Distribution of Income, consists of two separate studies. At the end of the first, which I called A Dynamic Theory of Racial Income Differences, when summarizing the implications of my ideas, I coined the phrase social capital. It describes one of the effects I'm trying to capture. My goal is to elaborate a simple model of income dynamics that takes account of social externalities in the acquisition of human capital. These spillovers occur because individuals are connected to one another via bonds of social and psychological affiliation. One result of this is that it is easier for people to acquire productive traits when they are socially linked with others who have been successful. I theorized that such communal networks of connectivity would, in a society like ours, reflect racial identity dynamics. When economists talk about human capital, they are referring to the productivity-enhancing traits individuals acquire through education, training, work experience, and some other route. These skills boost one's earnings potential, and the analyst can use them to explain differences in earnings among individuals. One simply measures the human capital, correlates that to individuals' earnings, and in this way, accounts for any disparity. My social capital notion extends this idea by imagining that the skill levels of those to whom a person is connected partly determines the level of skill that person ends up acquiring himself. My idea is that human development is not just transactional. It's not just people buying stuff out in the marketplace. It's also relational. It's people interacting with one another inside social networks.
Yeah, I just wanted it explained in his own words because I can't explain it as academically, as succinctly as I want, as he obviously can. This is the man who came up with the goddamn term, but it is truly beautiful. And again, remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is Glenn Loury in his dissertation, him graduating PhD program. He is the one that came up with the term social capital, giving it a meaning and a sense and so much weight in the world of economics that he just skyrockets. Who doesn't want to have him as a professor at their school? And that's enough of me fanning over who Glenn Loury was and is as a human being, because he is truly a very smart person. And this book shows that in many ways. And his life story is really, 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 really inspiring. But that's not why I like the book. That's not why I love this book. I love this book because of the lowlights. I love this book because he talks about his struggle in the most raw and open way I have seen in any memoir or autobiography in recent past. It is truly something to behold. People talk about being brave and talking about it's brave telling your story of how you were hurt. No, the truly brave thing to do is to come out and say, I fucked up in ABC way, and this is how I grew. Or even in this book, this is how I haven't grown yet. These are problems I still struggle with to this day. That is something I think is so important, especially reading an autobiography, because the problem I had when I was reading Kamala's biography was that it was just a list of her accomplishments. I didn't know her as a human being, because the human being that I got from that book was Kamala Harris is a perfect person. And I know that not to be true because there is no such thing. But Glenn Loury, he doesn't go the opposite way and shows all of his negative stuff. I was just praising him for all of the greatness that he did, specifically in academics. But this dude struggled, and a lot of it was self-inflicted. So let me just go down the list through the story of some of the things you might read that might shock you while reading this book. One or two of these things might blow your mind in a regular autobiography. This dude did all of it, and it's insane to me. The book starts out with him being like, silly, naughty kid. He's a kid. But when he's a teenager, he robs a car to go to prom with this girl he's trying to impress. He gets caught on the way to prom, and his excuse to the police officers is, I was going to return it after. I was just borrowing it without asking for permission. It's an insane thing. The dude doesn't even have his fucking license. He's borrowing a car that's not his. He ends up having 3 kids by the time he was 20. He does talk about his son that he has with a girl who is a mistress at the time, and how he disowned her, but throughout his life, he keeps coming back in his life for obvious fucking reasons because it's his son that he disowned. But he has 3 kids by the time he's 20. He cheats on his wife an insane amount. This is a professor in the elite colleges, a place where you think these kind of things you would not expect. But the details in which he talks about the way he's cheated on his wife is insane, right? He just has countless mistresses. He's constantly cheating on his wife. It's so bad that he ends up taking his mistress to work events. And mind you, his first wife, Linda Loury, works at the same college that Glenn does, and he's taking his mistress to these work events while his coworkers who know his fucking wife that works at the same fucking school as him are at these work events. It is kind of insane, the balls that this dude has. I hate to describe it that way. The ego that Glenn Loury has in these parts of his life is almost mind-blowing. There's this one episode where he takes one of his grad students. They go on a trip for an educational thing, and then on the way back from the trip, he takes one of his grad students on the way back from the airport to his mistress's house. Like, no care, no fucking shame. It's all like, you read it and you're like shaking with anger and frustration and just confusion at how someone could be so egotistical, so selfish, so fucking debilitatingly horrible. And at this point, when he's doing this cheating, he has a 4th and a 5th kid now with his wife, Linda. So now he's total 5 kids. 2 of them are his kids that he says are his kids, but live back in Chicago, and he's in New England living his grand life with his new wife at a new prestigious job, but at the same time cheating on his wife constantly. And it doesn't stop there. He ends up having an affair with his best friend's wife. Do I have to say any more? He ends up renting an apartment for one of his mistresses, and the whole situation ends up horrible because when he tries to finally kick out this mistress, she ends up fighting him and he gets arrested for assault, allegedly. And then at this point in his life, by the time he's trying to kick out this mistress and he gets arrested for assault, he's such a big deal in the economic world that I don't know which president it is. I'm pretty sure it's Nixon. I'm almost 100% sure it's Nixon, but he wants Glenn Loury to be a part of his cabinet once he gets elected. And it's insane because all of this that happens to Glenn Loury prevents him from being able to get to the echelon of academia, the kind of person that ends up being in those rooms that have to advise the president at what to do with this fucking country. And this is where it all breaks down. Because he gets arrested for the assault, obviously he can't be part of Nixon's cabinet, right? And then after that, shit goes bad. He doesn't stop his cheating, but what he does to cope with the fact that his life is falling apart, that he just lost the biggest opportunity of his life, he starts, this entire time he was smoking weed, he was drinking regularly, he never got too deep into that stuff, but at this point of his life, he's doing cocaine quite often, to the point where he starts to smoke crack. He gets addicted to crack. It's insane. The book is insane, and I'll leave it off there. He gives an example because he grew up on the south side of Chicago, so he understands the street. He feels at home on the street, but he's also a fucking genius. So when he's at Harvard, when he's at Brown, when he's at Michigan State or whatever college he ended up teaching at, he also owns those boardrooms, those classrooms, the way he owns the street. So he talks about being like Superman, being able to switch, being from Clark Kent to Superman and back and forth, and he just feels like a man of the universe, right? Like he gets to control it all. He gets all the things he ever wants all the time, no matter what. Who cares who he hurts? His life just spirals and spirals and spirals and spirals, and it's such an incredible roller coaster of a life, and you're constantly asking yourself, you have the American dream. By like chapter 10, this dude is living the American dream. And you're like 45-50% of the book before you're like, where else can this guy go? He's at the tippy top of academia halfway through the book. And he just keeps fucking up and he can't help himself. He just can't help himself. The only reason that I'm reading this book is because I do listen to his podcast, and it's called The Glenn Loury Show. And I just would recommend, if you do read this book, he does an interview with his son from Linda, his first wife. His son's name is Glenn Jr., and they have a conversation. There's just one thing I wanted to note. In that conversation, his son says that the hero of the story is Glenn's wife, his first wife, Linda. And if you read the story, the amount of shit that this woman had to deal with, that this man, Glenn Loury, put her through, it is insane that she continued to be with this man. And that's why I think it's such a wild book to read. Because he's an academic, it's not like he tries to intellectualize every mistake he does. No, he gives it to you raw. I was a dirty cheat. I was a womanizer. This is what I did. I fucked up all of these different ways. It's such a fucking crazy read. And the last thing I want to talk about is the fact that he is a Black conservative, right? He gets into a whole lot of controversies throughout his life. He talks about him swinging from conservative to becoming a Democrat, to swinging back to becoming a conservative. His critique of Obama in this book, I really like it. Because remember what I said, he grew up on the south side of Chicago. What everyone thinks is Obama grew up in the south side of Chicago, but he grew up with his white mom. I think his dad was from Kenya, and I don't know if Obama spent most of his time in Chicago, but he also lived in Hawaii for a good chunk of time. Let me just say it like this. His critique of Obama is really eye-opening and really made me look at Obama as a politician, as kind of, Obama is what everyone wants in a president, right? He is great at telling you what you want to hear. He gives you hope because he is good at that, right? Like, he's got the charisma, he knows how to speak to the people, he's just good at that. But he's also like a fucking fantastic politician. How much of the hope that he's giving you, that making you feel great, is real? And it almost, once you understand this perspective from Glenn Loury, who did grow up on the south side of Chicago. Actually, let me just read it because I have the quote right here. This is what Glenn Loury says about Obama. The election of a Black president was an achievement, but it belonged to the American populace, not to Obama himself. That we could progress from a nation that harbored a virtual apartheid regime within its borders to one with a Black president within my lifetime was remarkable. But the figurehead chosen to carry the torch of racial progress to the pinnacle of the American political system was, in my mind, little more than a political operator, albeit a gifted one. I did not doubt that Barack Obama was intelligent, but his self-presentation as an icon of American Blackness struck me as absurd. He had no real ties to the history of Black people in the country. If you took his Kenyan father, who he never really knew, out of the equation, I could see nothing of the African-American experience in his life. I couldn't accept the idea that he represented in his very being the ascension of Black Americans from slavery to full citizenship to prosperity. His endless touting of his ties to Chicago, with the implication that he was a product of the very same South Side that made me, only drove home that while he understood how to convey authenticity to the American public at large, there was almost nothing real about the persona that he presented for the TV cameras. End quote. So, in a nutshell, he's just saying that it isn't true that Obama grew up on the South Side of Chicago. It's just not true. And he didn't. He did not. So this picture that we have of Obama, of this dude who grew up in Chicago and who was living like the rest of the folks, the Black folks on the South Side, it's just not true. It isn't true. And that makes you question a whole lot of the other things that these politicians do. But Glenn Loury has always been the man from the south side of Chicago. And you need to read this book to understand how incredible a life he lived, the rags to riches story, the genius in a man, and the fucking stupidness, the ignorance, the hedonism that he lived with constantly. He does come out the other side, but my goodness, does it take him a long fucking time. It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. It truly, truly is. But what a read it was to read the life of this old dog. Ladies and gentlemen, I know I was all over the place with this book review, but his life is fucking all over the place. If you have read it, tell me what you think. If you haven't read it, or if you have any recommendations for other autobiographies that are just this crazy, please let me know. Catch you on the flip. Deuces.